It's my great pleasure to introduce to you the author of the book we're presenting today, The Symbolic State, Minority Recognition, Majority Backlash, and Secession in Multinational Countries by Karlo Basta. Karlo is connecting from Edinburgh, I assume, yeah. And he's an assistant professor of politics and international relations at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of the Center on Constitutional Change, and of course, the author, most importantly for us today, of this book. And we're thrilled that Eleanor or Ellie Knott accepted our invitation to be a discussant for this book. She's an assistant professor in qualitative methodology in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And importantly, she's also an author of a very recent book called Kin Majorities, Identity and Citizenship in Crimea and Moldova, which was recently published also by McGill University Press. So I don't want us to spend too much time in the introductions. I know Karlo has a relatively short for quite an extensive book, presentation of the book for about 20 minutes, and then Ellie will lead the discussion, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A. We're going to turn off our cameras while this is going on, and then I'm going to invite also our audience to turn on their cameras at the very end after Ellie has given her comments as well, and we'll have an A. Okay, thank you and welcome, Karlo.
Thank you, Harris. So I'm going to start sharing the screen. Please let me know if there are issues with the.
It looks great.
Yeah, good, excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you for the introduction and of course for the invite. And Ellie, thank you very much also for agreeing to join us, and congratulations on your book, which I'm very much looking forward to reading. And of course to the George Washington University, to Eliot School, and to the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies also a heartfelt thank you. So the book is obviously a work of sort of social science. I would say more probably social theory than political science, however, you know, people want to label it. But it's also, and in a way I actually pitched it to the publisher as a pamphlet of sorts. And it's a pamphlet about the distinctiveness and the importance of the multinational state. Now, when people talk about the state, the modern state, right, in general terms, as a principle of organization, quite a few people, scholars, journalists, politicians, and others, find it very difficult even to utter the term state without that you know, typical prefix that normally goes with it, right? The nation state, right? So it's almost a reflex to when we want to, you know, refer to the modern state, that we actually call it the nation state. And what that suggests, of course, is that the nation state in some sense is the norm, the dominant model of political organization of modernity, which of course wouldn't be too much of a problem if not for the fact that a significant proportion of the world's countries today and in the past 200 years, say, have not been nation states, have been in fact at the very least dubiously national, or have been full on what I call in the book multinational states. So what I'm trying to do with this book is kind of make the case that multinational states operate on a logic that is very, very specific to them, and that is fundamentally different from the logic of nation state. And so the book is in a way a product of frustration with the fact that even though, as I'll be arguing, multinational state, first of all, is distinctive from nation state and quite important as a political phenomenon, we lack a subfield that is explicitly and systematically dedicated to the study of this particular political phenomenon, the study of the multinational state. So now I don't want to assume that everybody who's in the audience is as sort of interested in the multinational state as such. So I will say a few words as to why I think multinational states are important, right? So as I just mentioned, multinational states are subject to the logic of their own. And I think they're subject also to some fairly unique features and particularly fragility. So multinational states are far more susceptible definitionally to territorial fragmentation than, let's say, again, definitionally nation states would be. And when these tendencies or possibilities of fragmentation kind of come to the fore, they affect not only the populations of those nationally plural countries themselves, but also they affect the broader region in which the country might find itself, and potentially might have reverberations across, or spillovers across the globe. So this includes, of course, economic and security spillovers, the fact that when conflicts flare up in multinational states that tend to influence the legal norms and the legal practices. And I would also argue that we can think, or at least I think, of multinational states as these very particular nodes in the fabric of the international arena that are especially susceptible to great power or external power meddling, and therefore susceptible to great power or stimulating great power conflict. And again, I emphasize, despite of this importance, these are only some of the reasons that I think multinational states should be studied more systematically. We do not have an expressly dedicated subfield that focuses specifically on the multinational state and its specific dynamics. Now, I'm not trying to say that people have not studied multinational states. Of course, that's manifestly not correct. But again, think about it in the following way, right? So there is no Oxford Handbook of the Multinational State. There is no piece in the annual review of political science or annual review of sociology that is dedicated expressly and specifically to the multinational state itself, right? So this was the kind of the motive, the underlying kind of frustration that motivated the writing of this book. Now, kind of heading towards summary of the book's argument, the book's argument is also in a sense a product of a frustration, but it's a frustration with the way in which that body of work that has touched on certain segments of the multinational state experience, that body of work has done it in a very, very kind of particular way that does reveal some quite important things about these kinds of countries, but also occludes a lot, hides a lot as well. So what I mean by that is that there's a kind of a fairly pervasive instrumentalism about a lot of the work about multinational, multi-ethnic states out there. And what I mean by that is this notion that when crises or political conflict flares up in these kinds of countries, that one of the key reasons behind that political conflict are material, for lack of a better word, factors, resources, things of that nature, perhaps security. And so what I do in this book is I think I show that at least in the 4 cases that I treat here, and the 4 cases are Canada, Spain, former Yugoslavia, and former Czechoslovakia, at least in these 4 cases, while those material kinds of elements were important, they don't exhaust the explanation as to why there was an escalation in political conflict in all of them, one way or another. Of course, qualitatively different political conflict, but political conflict nonetheless. Now, when I'm talking about this political conflict, I'm emphasizing particularly the kind of conflict that draws in broad masses of the population. And so that's my starting point. I want, in all 4 of the countries that the book treats, I started with an inflection point, a particular moment in time where representatives of minority nations, and in all 4 instances, the key claimants for greater self-determination were demographic minorities, but I use minority nations as a shorthand, which is problematic, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. In all 4 of these cases, there's this inflection point where there's a qualitatively different demand being articulated by the purported representatives of these minority nations. Right? And so that moment in which that claim is made is kind of consists of two dimensions. The claim is simultaneously a claim for more resources, more self-government, more levers of power in order to achieve other things. For example, the greater protection of political or economic or cultural interests of the community in question. And I call that the instrumental side of this demand. But the other side of the ledger, the other side of this claim is the demand for recognition, right? So it's not merely a demand for more resources in order to be able to do other things, but it's also a demand for the recognition, first of all, that the community in question is a nation in its own right, rather than simply let's say a folkloric community or regional community, right? That it is a people with a right to self-determination or self-government. And by extension, it's also a demand, it's an ask from the central government to recognize that the state in which this community finds itself, the Canada, the Spain, the Yugoslavia, the Czechoslovakia, is not a nation state, that it's in fact a state with a plurality of national communities. Now, this recognition can take a variety of forms, and I focus on two in the book. The first is kind of the formal reform of institutions of territorial autonomy. And so, for example, in Spain or in Canada, this takes the form of a demand for territorial asymmetry. In the other two, it actually took the form of territorial symmetry, but that's, again, a different kind of question. So that's the first way of kind of expressing a different vision of what the state actually is. And the other is what I call in the book constitutional stamping, which is explicit constitutional reform or quasi-constitutional reform that basically affirms that a particular community is a nation or a distinct society, and even potentially that the state in question is actually a multinational state. So that's my starting point. And from that starting point, I develop a kind of dynamic, I don't want to call it a model necessarily, more a heuristic, but what I'm going to be talking to you about in the next couple of minutes. And this is where the following comes into play, the argument, as it were, right? So this is our starting point, right? That kind of twofold demand, that claim for both the instrumental and the symbolic, what I call concession. Now, the central government is then presented with a dilemma or a choice as to how to respond to these particular demands, and provided some other political dynamics sort of cooperate, and I'm not going to get too much into the details of this. The initial response to these demands is, let's say, partial. So in all four of the cases, the central government responds by, in effect, granting or addressing those instrumental demands for greater fiscal autonomy, greater economic autonomy, or more powers over a certain number of jurisdictions, but is far more reluctant to engage in any far-reaching symbolic reconstitution of the state itself. And what's interesting about this is what it does to the politics of the minority region, right? So in one way, the result is indeterminate, but in another one, it's quite interesting for the dynamic inside of the region itself. So let's say the moderates in the minority region, those who believe that more could be had in kind of cooperation or through negotiations with the central state, are basically saying to their constituents, look, we got something in this particular round. We can keep going until we actually expand our self-government to the point that actually satisfies our aspirations. But of course, there's the other part of the political elite that is far less patient. It's basically looking at what has just been granted and says, well, look, I mean, this is probably the most that we can hope from this bunch of people at the center. And so they are articulating this secessionist argument where they're saying, this is simply not enough, and let's demand full external self-determination. And what this situation does is it results in a kind of outbidding dynamic that stimulates mobilization along identity lines in the minority region, that lends itself ultimately, and normally over a fairly extended period of time, to a restatement of this demand for greater self-determination, both on instrumental and symbolic side of things. Except at this particular point, that symbolic element, the symbolic demand, has been built into something almost like a totem, right? So it's a far more pronounced element of the demand or the claim in the second round. Now, the central government at this point can no longer respond in the same way in which it has responded in round one. It can't simply say, okay, here's more money or a few more kind of areas that you can kind of control for yourself, in part because that mobilization that has unfolded normally over some years has transformed the political reality of the situation, right? So in the second round, the central government responds both on the instrumental and on the symbolic side, right? So in other words, it both grants more powers or more resources, but it also is more willing to extend some sort of major recognition of the kind that is being requested by the claimant community. And here the situation changes completely. And the reason for that is because up until that point, the burden of identity adjustment has been primarily on the backs of the minority collective, right? It's this minority group that had to probably, if it's a group that actually speaks a distinctive language, it was a minority group that had to speak both languages. It is the minority group that has had to kind of negotiate the fact that it finds itself in a state that it considers somewhat its own, but not entirely, etc. Right? Whereas on the flip side, in this particular moment, this burden of adjustment is now thrown on the backs of the majority community. So the majority communities, this is not always the case, but they tend to be more likely to identify with the whole state, and they tend to be more likely to have this monistic understanding that the political community that is contained within the state is a single political community, no matter what its internal differentiation is, right? But at this particular point, where there is an attempt by the central government to change this, it is now incumbent upon the majority population to rethink of the way in which they conceive of themselves, their own collective identity, and as importantly, the way in which they see the state that they normally think of as their own. So what this does is it creates resentment that creates a kind of set of preconditions for a majority backlash. What I mean by that is a kind of politicized mobilization by at least a segment of political society among majority community that is directly opposed to these concessions that have just been made. And that is, in addition to that, quite dramatic and public, and involves a kind of broad general public on behest of this kind of opposition. So that's a very different kind of thing than the kind of opposition, maybe legislative opposition, where kind of behind closed doors you can undercut the kinds of concessions that have been made, or through relatively opaque legal channels, court challenges, and things of that nature, right? So what happens as a consequence of the majority backlash are three political consequences. The first one is that backlash very, very publicly demonstrates to the minority community that there's a very substantial proportion of the population on the other side, right, in the rest of the country, who are simply unwilling or incapable of reimagining the state in this multinational key, right? So that's the first consequence. The second one is that the backlash increases very significantly the likelihood that any concession that has been made just now is going to be reversed or rescinded. And both of those basically weaken the hand of the moderates among the minorities and strengthen the hand of the radicals. And as a consequence, there is a far greater likelihood of a secessionist crisis of actually occurring. And I define a secessionist crisis as a jump in support for secession to 50% or more, and the turn by the regional government towards actually trying to actualize that call for independence through preparing for a referendum or demanding a referendum, things of that nature. Right now, it won't surprise you that the book, given that it has been published, finds that this argument holds water in most of these cases. So what I want to do now is just very quickly run down some of the findings. So what you see here in the left column is essentially what I just told you, just in a tabular form. So where there's no symbolic concession, there should be no majority backlash, and vice versa. Where there is a symbolic concession, I expected a majority backlash. And then again, where there is no majority backlash, there should be no secessionist crisis. And in the presence of a majority backlash, there ought to be a secessionist crisis, right? So just want to very quickly kind of run down this, a set of confirming, disconfirming, and ambiguous causal process observations, or basically outcomes, right? So in effect, in Canada and Spain and Yugoslavia, and I'm looking at Canada, Yugoslavia, basically from 1960 for the next 30 years or so, Spain from 1980 to about 2017, give or take. In the early going, there were quite far-reaching concessions, right? In terms of, again, fiscal decentralization, greater spending power, greater revenue-raising power, and a range of other bits of decentralization on economic policy, social policy, immigration policy, etc. And even though there were quite substantial concessions there, there was really no majority backlash in any of the three countries during what I call round one. But once the central governments in all three ventured to essentially kind of rework the symbolic makeup of the country, in all three of these countries, you see a sustained majority backlash. In Yugoslavia, the third backlash came quite late, and I argue that that's in part because of the regime type, but it came nevertheless. Now, again, the expectation is no majority backlash, no secessionist crisis, and the only case that I have for that is Czechoslovakia. Now, you will with full right say, hang on, didn't Czechoslovakia break up? And of course, you would be right, except Czechoslovakia broke up because, or due to an elite deal between the leaders of the Czech and the Slovak republics, and the support for independence itself in Slovakia during the time period that I'm looking at it, which is 1989 to 1992, 93, support for independence never exceeded 20%. And the only political party arguing for outright independence never won more than, I think, 12 or 13% in any of the elections. And then finally, in all three of the cases where there was majority backlash, there was in fact a secessionist crisis. Different intensities with different outcomes, of course. We can talk about these differences also in the Q&A. Now, in terms of outright disconfirming bits of evidence, and I tried to be as harsh to my argument as I could. I did not find anything that outright disconfirmed these expectations, but I did find two ambiguous ones, right? And I want to kind of very, very quickly run through them before I wrap up. One was, so there's this expectation there where if there is a fairly far-reaching symbolic concession by the central government, then there's going to be some sort of majority backlash. Some political party is going to start to mobilize against those kinds of concessions. Now, there was something like this happening in Czechoslovakia between 89 and 92. So during this time period, the Czech and Slovak elites are engaged in constitutional reform because the country, of course, is undergoing transition of all sorts, right? The democratic transition, the transition to capitalism, and so forth. And throughout these negotiations, constitutional negotiations, the Czech negotiators were fully willing to accept the notion that Czechoslovakia was a multinational state, that Slovakia was the nation state of the Slovak people. And in fact, they actually accepted the possibility, constitutional possibility of secession, which is quite rare, in comparative constitutionalism. So what gives? Well, the reason I'm treating this as an ambiguous outcome is twofold. The first is that this was not a new bit of symbolic concession. Since 1968, the last round of constitutional reform during the Prague Spring, the Czechoslovak constitution essentially articulated this notion of Czechoslovakia as a multinational state. So both the elite and the population of Czech Republic had more than about a generation, more than 20 years to get themselves accustomed to this idea of Czechoslovakia as a multinational state. But the other reason is that there was, in fact, a new demand, new symbolic demand, qualitatively new, by the Slovak representatives. And that was for that any new constitution formally be a result of so-called state treaty. So what they were asking for is that once the constitution is actually passed, that formally this be expressed as two independent states actually coming to an agreement. And that bit of symbolic demand, and it was purely symbolic and had absolutely no political or policy significance, that demand itself was steadfastly refused by the Czech negotiators. Had they not done that, it would have been an interesting thing to see what kind of political dynamic would have resulted from that. And then the last ambiguous kind of observation, where that seemingly contradicts this notion that in the absence of majority backlash, there will be no secessionist crisis, of course, Quebec during the 1970s, where there was a rise in support for Parti Québécois, the relatively recently formed secessionist party. And that party, of course, held a referendum on sovereignty in 1980, where 40% of the population voted in favor of quote unquote sovereignty association. Now, the reason this is an ambiguous sort of outcome is again twofold. The first is that Parti Québécois did not really come to power in 1976 on this wave of mobilization for independence. Rather, it was a set of contingent political factors in Quebec at that particular time, the extreme unpopularity of the Liberal Party of Quebec, and the fact that Parti Québécois actually dampened, that it de-radicalized on independence and promised that they will have a referendum, but if they were to win, they're not going to immediately proclaim independence. They're going to negotiate with Canada. And they asked not for outright independence, but what they called sovereignty association, which was a combination of political independence, but really close economic integration. And just to bolster this further, throughout the 1970s, polls showed that outright independence never again won more or attracted more than 20% of popular support, whereas sovereignty association obviously did. So that, in a nutshell, and I hope that wasn't too much, then we can talk about it, we can go back and forth, is the findings themselves. And I want to emphasize, just before I wrap up, that in all of those instances where very far-reaching, very substantial, actual, tangible concessions were made to minority regions, but where those concessions were not combined with this fairly loud, right, and obvious symbolic reconstitution of the state, in none of these instances was there a sort of majority backlash that materialized, and in none of these instances do you see a very significant jump in support for secession. But in those cases, so the three cases in which there was an attempt to combine the what I call instrumental with the symbolic concessions, you do have in all three cases fairly widespread mobilization on the majority side against those concessions, and as a consequence of that, also a very, very strong increase in support for independence. And just very briefly, the so what question, what does this do? What kind of contribution is this? We could spend quite a bit of time on this, but I want to foreground three contributions. The first one, and I think the one that is the most important from the perspective of comparative politics and sort of political science in general, is this kind of understanding that institutions themselves can be symbols, right? So when there are certainly people who talk about symbolic politics in the context of nationalism studies, but they talk about what I would call folkloric symbols that are primarily there to serve a function of representing something else, whereas institutions themselves that we don't normally think of symbols, I would argue are, and I think in the book I show, I hope convincingly, that if we understand institutions as symbols, that this provides us with a key to open up all kinds of doors and to kind of account for all kinds of interesting outcomes. The second bit is this understanding that there's a sort of dialectic, right, between majority and minority nationalism, and without understanding that dialectic, it's very, very difficult to get a grip on the dynamics of conflict in multinational states. And then the final bit is essentially this observation that institutions, let's say, of territorial autonomy are not these prefabricated kind of edifices that you can just plop into the ground, and it's not really their features, inherent features, that are helpful or might not be helpful in management of conflict in multinational states, but the very way in which those institutions are established is probably as important, if not more important, than the actual features of the institutions themselves. And I'll leave it there. I hope that was 20 minutes, Harris.
Thank you so much, Karlo.
I think we can stop share.
Yeah.
There we go.
So without any further delays, I will ask Ellie to make her comments. It was a pretty dense talk because you tried to summarize a lot. So I'm giving some time for everybody to grab some water and look away from the screen and then come back. And then Ellie can start. Yeah.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this book. I guess I will try to do so in a way that is empathetic, because while it's, as an author, amazing to discuss your work, it's also, you know, it kind of is out there. It's a piece, it's done, and you're kind of being asked and probed on questions that you can't really affect the published work, but you can kind of, I guess, think about future things that you want to work on. So I'm going to talk a bit about what the book does, kind of steer towards some things that I think are particularly insightful, and then I have some questions for Karlo. So as I was reading this very kind of thorough, super interesting comparative work, where a lot of kind of work has gone into this empirically and kind of navigating the complexity, I was reading the kind of the final chapter, and I think the final chapter in particular is among kind of my favorite parts of the book, because it kind of takes us on this reflexive journey, and I'll come back to that in a second. But just to talk about the way in which Karlo is doing this work, he kind of references this guerrilla army that is treating this guerrilla army that kind of understands that social categories, that the meaning of social categories matter, and we can't treat it as if that the meaning of these social categories or these institutions doesn't matter, and that the symbolic nature of states, and the multinational states in particular, and how this kind of manifests in varied and contingent ways, and I think Karlo's work is really about exploring that dynamism and contingency, should be studied in terms of its variation over space and time, and not just kind of assumed. And I think, as I was reading this book, he was very much preaching to the converted on that in a great way. So Karlo introduced the cases of the book, and I think one thing that I wanted to comment on was just how fascinating this was in terms of a cross-regional comparison, drawing on cases in Western Europe, in Spain, Catalonia, North America in terms of Canada and Quebec, and two post-communist examples in Central Europe with Czechoslovakia, and then the Balkans in terms of Yugoslavia and Croatia. And doing so in a way that is kind of clear of what the cases are and why they're being selected in terms of this different manifestations of the relationship between claimant governments and central governments, and how and why those entities are either pro-market or state interventionists, and kind of, again, that level of complexity that's coming through this cross-regional comparison, and really emphasizing the importance of symbolic politics in a way that is asking us new questions about multinational states, and asking us to question why multinational states haven't been thought of in this way. And I guess it helped me to think about what I take for granted as a scholar of nationalism and identity and citizenship, that there can be this way of studying the multinational state that has emphasized resources and interests, but not kind of looked at that symbolic component as Karlo was doing. That kind of incongruity of institutional visions, as he talks about, as kind of the moving force behind identity conflict in multinational states, and how the majority self-understandings and the threats that they perceive to ontological security is as important as, and Karlo was talking about at the end, is as important as the kind of minority self-understanding. We shouldn't just see minorities as sources of instability, but see majorities also as sources of instability. And he talks about this kind of mutually assured misrecognition that can't be easily adjusted, and kind of encourages retrenchment on both sides. And I think that is really interesting, and how things are both contingent, but kind of have this intractable character at the same time, and kind of how individuals are then kind of lifelong socialized into these community narratives, whether within the majority or within the minority. Going kind of back to chapter 8, I think Karlo takes us on this really interesting reflexive journey around how he came to configure or to re-understand what he was kind of researching in the first place. He talks about this kind of particularly vexing conversation that he had with a participant that was stubbornly pushing back against his questions about Czechoslovak discord, telling him that economics didn't matter, that it wasn't central to conflict, that it was about clashing visions of statehood. And he tells us about how he did nothing with this information. He chose it to ignore it as background noise to the real stuff, because he himself had kind of been socialized within an institutional, the kind of the study of institutions that had suggested that what matters is resources and interests, that's the way to study the politics of institutions, the way to study institutions and multinational states. And so I think this is really interesting and useful, and that's why I wanted to bring it out at this point as kind of ongoing researchers, graduate students, to kind of see the importance to challenge our own assumptions. And the kind of documentation of your own resistance, I think, is an amazing and great insight, and something that I would like to see authors do more of. How we do need to kind of engage with that, what we can see as uncomfortable evidence, that we need to be mindful of the analytical blinders that come from how we've been socialized within these dominant traditions. And then as Karlo talks about, how these kind of blinders fell off and how we kind of came round to the sociological institutionalist position, and then realizing kind of the importance of and the value of meanings of institutions as much as their instrumental function. And so he then talks about how the political economy narrative works to some extent, but it was kind of narrow and misleading. And it was really the combination of instrumental and symbolic claims, that it wasn't just about resources and power, but it was also about the kind of symbolic formal recognition of multinationality. And so kind of what he's telling us is how this political economy story has severe kind of downsides for telling the fuller picture of how central government really respond to symbolic claims, and can't really account for more interesting outcomes, such as the secessionist crises that he's looking at. The importance of institutions as symbols, how they're expressed, enacted, suppressed, or erased, and that the story about who gets what and how that's institutionalized are kind of stories that are difficult to reconcile, but we have to do this work of looking at the complexities and contingencies and specificities of meaning and how they vary over time and space within and across units of analysis. So I want to move on a bit to what this prompted me to think about, and what I kind of wanted to follow up in this session. And I wondered a bit about what the implications for nationalism studies are, or kind of how we study nations and nationalism. I think Karlo offers some suggestions, but I kind of want to push a little bit beyond that in our discussion. I think that majority nationalism matters, even if majorities try to escape this frame, as Karlo has documented. But I also wondered if, I mean, in a sense, that the book ends up, as it begins, in kind of setting out what a subfield of studying the multinational state looks like. And so the implication is almost that we need to study nation states differently to how we study multinational states. Kind of not study multinational states as if they are nation states. But I wondered if that kind of allows the nation state as an ideal type to get away with more than it really should, which is that nationally homogenous polities don't really exist. It's more about how the nation state is self-imagining, that majority is self-imagining to be homogenous in the first place. That there's a kind of power to produce the nation state as homogenous, when really most nation states are multinational. They might not be multinational in the sense of how that's institutionalized, but they are certainly multinational in terms of how they're made up, whether through migration or indigenous minority communities. I mean, even Poland has minorities, but they're very rarely recognized as such. And so really, does the nation state exist at all as an ideal type is kind of one of the questions that I was kind of coming out of this book asking. Or is this subfield of multinational states really the kind of the scope conditions are predominantly with regard to kind of what we would probably consider more kind of ethno-federations. I think the book is very rich and insightful in terms of the complexity of the methodology that goes into this work. The combination of kind of comparison across these 4 cases and the process tracing, the kind of the causal process tracing, comparative process tracing that is within it. And I really look forward to putting this book on my reading list. But I wondered, kind of going back to that reflexive journey that you document in the last chapter, if you could say a bit more about the journey, I guess, the methodological journey of this project. Like, where did the cases come from? How did you go about? I mean, theoretically, we understand where they came from, but is there also a kind of another way in which you came to these cases and you came to the hypotheses? Certainly, you document the expectations of the literature, and then kind of how that was challenged by, for example, the interviews that you did in the Czechoslovak case, and we can kind of assume that process also happened in the other cases. But I think what's really interesting then is a work that sets out looking quite deductive in terms of the expectations that we have and the way that we seek to test those, actually looks implicitly more kind of iterative. And I wondered if that was kind of a reflection of how you see the work, that there is this kind of iterative dimension, because I think it's also really important as researchers to kind of expose that the iterations and how theory testing can often break down, and what happens when that theory testing does break down. How do we come up then with those new ideas, and how are those kind of navigated by the project? My final comments, really, I think that the book does a really good job in terms of setting out the scope conditions, being very specific about the type of state that is being considered, although I do wonder if we're kind of talking about institutionalized multinational states, but rather than just multinational states per se. I think in political science, we're often socialized to think that generalizability is a standard that we should be aspiring to, but it's often difficult when we're doing this kind of work, because what we're really talking about is empirical generalizability, as if what we're looking for is empirical universalities. And Karlo discusses a lot in the book about it's primarily about the cases being considered with implications for other things that aren't being considered. But I think re-emphasizing or reshifting that the discussion is actually about theoretical transferability. And I think that there is a strong theoretical transferability that happens in this book. And I think just using new words, using not necessarily the idea of theoretical transferability isn't a new idea, but I think we need not just a kind of subfield of multinational states, we also need to be getting behind other terms that are actually empowering for the kind of work that we want to do. And on that idea of theoretical transferability, the case that I was thinking about throughout this book was of Scotland. It comes up a little bit in terms of how you discuss the tensions with Lecour's work, but I did wonder a bit about what the implications are when we look at, you know, the kind of social economic model of Scotland versus the UK or England is within that spectrum of pro-interventionist minority and pro-market central government, at least as the UK is currently configured. It's discussed somewhat in the conclusion, but I think something else that was kind of striking for me was that Scotland also has a kind of very, maybe not particular, but an interesting minority nationalism based very much, at least in terms of what is purported, around civic nationalism and civic identity claims. And I kind of wondered if that was something worth exploring in terms of what the implications are for multinational states when that symbolic institutional function is of a civic nature. It's not really about culture and cultural recognition. It's not necessarily even so much about language. It's about the right to be symbolically more of a social democracy, say, than the rest of the UK, and that those social norms are symbolic in nature, and they're kind of a differentiation from the rest of the UK. And then I just wondered about the kind of future research agenda that you see in terms of where this new subfield that you're seeking to create, kind of what the future avenues are for that. I will stop talking. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this book.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Karlo, you can turn on your mic first and your camera.
In that order.
You can briefly respond if you want to the many questions, especially some of the explicit questions, because there were many implicit ones. And then we can open up for a Q&A. Yeah.
So, I mean, Ellie, thank you. So this is such a generous reading of the book, and also quite substantive, probing here as well. And you should have seen, I was nodding quite a lot, very vigorously, as I was listening to you. So I'll try, and Harris, please, if I get carried away, just cut me off. But I'll try to address as quickly as I can the points that you raised here. Starting from the first one, in terms of the challenge, whether or not we do actually have nation states, and what does it mean to call a particular polity a nation state? I think I'm generally sympathetic to the idea that there are no countries in the world that are, in some sense, I hesitate to use the term politically homogenous. And that's where my response in effect is, right? So I think that there are countries that can be characterized by such a wide scope of diversities internally, right? And yet those diversities need not become politicized in that sense of a claim for self-determination. Right? So I would say, and you're right, all four of these cases were at some point institutionalized, or they were trying to, in some sense, institutionalize this multinationalism, even if implicitly. But there are countries, of course, that I consider to be multinational that haven't done that, or that were resisting that militarily, right? So Sri Lanka is an obvious example with the Tamils, right? You could argue Turkey with the Kurds, et cetera, right? So there are countries where you can have this fairly consistent claim for self-determination by a particular community that is meeting a wall, right? Where the institutionalization is simply not forthcoming. Now, I would not call them multinational because the government itself refuses to do so, right? But I think that then you kind of go towards the kind of far end of these examples where either what could be nascent national communities do not stake a claim that strikes us as national, or they do, but they're so small, for example, let's say the Corsicans in France, where the question then becomes, well, what kind of a state is France, right? Even though it considers itself to be this kind of paragon of nation, Jacobin nation statehood, is it really, and does it matter that they have this bit down there, right, as an attachment? So, great question. I need to think about it more, right? Because I'm stumped by it a little bit, because I really, because there is, it's fairly easy to recognize things maybe on the extremes, a Japan versus a, let's say former Yugoslavia, or today Bosnia or Ethiopia, but then there's such a range in between. So I would say that while I agree with you that there's no purely nationally homogeneous polities in the world, I think there are degrees of approximation, right, to either side. The second issue was with sort of the case selection, and as you were speaking about this, I just found myself thinking about how, in a way, tortuous the process of formalizing the argument was, because you're absolutely right. Once you formalize that argument in a kind of Popperian falsificationist kind of sense, then you're given where the project actually came from, you're essentially lying to yourself, right? Because this is not what this thing actually is in itself. But I mean, there are the performative demands of our discipline are such where there is always a kind of demand for a sort of a grafting of a particular formality onto an argument that betrays something else, or perhaps misleads the reader and even the author themselves to say that this kind of a project is actually something that it is otherwise. And that's why I felt it very necessary in that last chapter that you discussed to say, well, look, I kind of started from this deductive thing, which in itself was since you asked, where's this come from? I mean, it's a personal journey, right? So I come from former Yugoslavia, the country breaks apart. I arrived to Canada in 1993. That's 2 years before the Quebec referendum, right? So if that doesn't predispose you to studying that kind of stuff, I don't know what will, right? And so then, I'm reading, kind of developing this argument that was the political economy argument that you talked about, which ultimately ended up not satisfying either myself or people who were, supervising my dissertation, right? And then I kind of pushed myself beyond that through all of those subsequent experiences that I had studying those and other cases. So I think there's definitely something to be said for being, I think, transparent about the iterative nature of these things. And I think this is something, you're right, this needs to be taught to students, whether it's an uphill battle or at least what the uphill gradient is, I think is an open question. I think it depends on the kind of school that we're dealing with. And in terms of the last question with in terms of Scotland, I mean, the one thing that I do want to emphasize, and that's something I think I may be, because I haven't actually read the book in a while, nor have I presented it in a couple of months. But and I think you're absolutely right that there's something about this notion that Scots are in some way more socially democratic than the rest of the UK, and so that the claim itself is somehow qualitatively different from some of the other claims that you see in other parts of the world, right? And I think arguably the more similar the populations across the country are in some objective criteria, probably the more important these kinds of differentiators are. And that's why I was very careful about the claims that I was making in terms of generalizability. But since you mentioned the UK, I find the UK to be a very un-European case. It's which I'm sure, for a number of other reasons we can agree. In the sense that in the UK, what you see is actually the reverse of what I observed in all of these countries, which is that recognition came first. Symbolic recognition came first. I mean, UK is almost genetically, its flag, even the name, is a multinational state. But it was those instrumental bits and pieces, the institutions, that came very, very, very late, right? And I find this to be an interesting phenomenon, and I hope, and this is in part a response to your question, I hope to have the resources and the time to be able to explore further the hunch that I wanted to say British people, but people of the UK have, to the extent to which we can generalize, a very different attitude toward the state as such that is very, very un-European. So continental Europeans, for all of their differences, there's a kind of more of a statism about the political culture. And even the verbiage that is being used in the UK to characterize the institutions of the state is very indicative to my mind, right? Like, so it's number 10, it's Westminster, it's Whitehall, it's not the state. Whereas the state means something. When you say the state in France, l'État, or when you say Estado or Stad, right, or Država, there's a kind of difference, I think, there that is very interesting, and I think it's a difference that suggests the need to further probe the differences in understanding of the state, not only between the UK and the European continent, but across the world. And I think that's a very important path down which we could be going.
Thank you so much. Another interesting observation is that I think, Karlo, you've only lived and worked in multinational states yourself.
You're absolutely right.
So there may be a psychoanalytic version here of the answer. I have a question by Henry Hale. I don't know if he can connect right now. I can read it otherwise. So Henry has asked, first of all, he has congratulated you on the book and says he's wondering basically how the treatment, or how you would treat different reactions across different minorities in the same state. And in particular, he has in mind, not surprisingly, the case of the case of the USSR, where there was great symbolic concessions given, but only a few republics, those concessions generated secessionist crisis only in a few republics, not all of them.
Mm. Yeah. So, and I wish that it would be nice to hear Henry speak. I don't know if he can.
He's listening to you. Yeah. I think he's walking over for the workshop now.
I see. All right.
Yeah.
So Henry, I mean, first of all, thank you very much. And thank you for, you know, I've been modeling a lot of what I do, and I've read your work repeatedly over the years. So thank you very much for that as well. It's a good question. It's one that I didn't really, and it's an odd thing that I didn't consider it. But one of the reasons that I didn't explicitly consider it is because I think there's something to be said for the primary dynamic between the largest minority community and then the quote unquote majority, or the state nation, or Stadtvolk, or whatever you want to call them, right? Even if it's a nascent Stadtvolk. And I think that a lot of what happens further down the chain is probably in some ways, although as I'm thinking this, I'm thinking, of course, of the Baltics, and I'm thinking, well, that actually doesn't work, because this is where the things actually heated up in the case of the Soviet Union. But I mean, in the ones that I am familiar with, it would be the primary conflict tends to kind of be between that largest one. And so I kind of reserved my analytical gaze, I think, for that kind of interaction. And even though that interaction ebbs and flows over time, I found that it is the most consistent kind of line of conflict in these kinds of countries. But of course, it's, you know, it's not the only one. I'll have to think about the question that you asked me. One of the reasons that I didn't really touch the USSR in the book is because I understood that if I did, I would have to probably spend another couple of years studying in order to do it justice. And so I'll have to, I'm not happy with the answer that I gave you, but I'm going to have to think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I would like to invite people to turn on their cameras if they're still around. It will make it easier to have a conversation. And Liz, you can ask your question directly, with 2 questions. Can you
Sorry about that.
There you go.
Trying to figure out the muting and unmuting. Thank you so much, Karlo and Ellie, for your wonderful presentations. I'm really excited to be listening to this, to have this minority and secessionist talk and thinking about it. And I'm excited to read both of your books. Karlo, when you were presenting your slide about this cycle, I'm interested in knowing what you observed about how politicians could interrupt that cycle. Where could they do something to not get eventually to that secessionist crisis? Because I think a lot of politicians are interested in maintaining the, you know, like a happy population and the you know, the integrity of the state. And then also, because Ellie brought up the Scottish case, I'm also interested in how your theory applies to a supranational organization like the EU and the Brexit case. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ellie, do you want to go first and then back to Karlo?
Was there a question? Yeah. No, Karlo, totally go for it.
Okay. Yeah.
Cheers. Thank you very much. So Liz, thank you. When I completed the book, it kind of struck me. I was like, okay, well, this is a depressing one because it seems that in every case, in a way, I was happy because I was like, oh my God, well, this actually kind of works, you know. But on the flip side, it's like, is this inevitable? Is this overdetermined? And so I think if there's the kind of policy lesson, it would be twofold from the perspective of the central elites, that is, right? Because they're the ones that have these, they control the game in a sense, because it's on them to decide how to respond, to what extent to respond, etc. Right? So one kind of response would be, well, you know, don't engage in any kind of far-reaching symbolic concessions. Try to see how much you can do with the instrumental stuff, or make those concessions as kind of, should I put it, inconspicuous as possible. I think the problem there, though, is that is in what I was mentioning as I was explaining that kind of, you know, the spiral bit, which is that at some point the mobilization among the minority population is so kind of clear in terms of what is kind of being demanded, that anything that falls short of that particular response might not actually suffice, or at least the perception from the elites would be that it might not suffice, right? So I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if those kinds of concessions were to be continued. In other words, well, here's more resources, or here's another area of policy making that you can control, but not explicitly, but basically kind of staying away from this general reconstitution of the symbolic framework of the state. And I think that's probably might be, in a Machiavellian kind of approach, kind of a wise thing to do. The alternative to that would be, if you're going to go as far as in the three cases that I kind of foreground, where you did have these far-reaching symbolic concessions, and I can talk about them if anybody has any questions about what specifically they meant, or what they were. If you're going to do that, make sure that you have as thorough a buy-in from all the potential spoilers on the majority side. But the problem is that the politics of the moment could be such that you don't really know how much control you have. So today you might have control, but in a year, half a year, as the process of reform kind of heats up, new kind of, let's call them, provisionally rogue actors can kind of emerge on the majority side, and they might be able to sort of, mobilize that kind of majority resentment and turn it into something politically potent. So I've been thinking about that. And that's one of the things, in fact, since you asked me about the UK, I mean, you asked me about Brexit, but maybe I'm a politician in the making because I'm answering the question, not the one that you asked, but that's one of the reasons. So I don't know if you're kind of following, but there's been a lot of talk over the past 2 years about constitutional reform in the UK. And the constitutional reform that is going to be suggested or proposed by Gordon Brown, the former prime minister, that's supposed to be coming out in about a month. And that reform is going to call for the replacement of the House of, most likely, the replacement of the House of Lords into a territorial chamber, a chamber of nations and regions, right? And possibly some tinkering with intergovernmental affairs, and possibly further devolution for England. I think that's an interesting one, because it would be at that particular point that the English population would be expected to change the way in which they think of themselves, right? So that kind of reform that would be that far-reaching would essentially demand that some sort of a different kind of institutional identity complex emerge in England. Because in England, there's this kind of very, very easy elision between Britishness and Englishness. And if you were to do some sort of more symmetric kind of devolution deal across the UK, what you're doing is basically you're undermining that. You're asking the English people to basically prize apart their Britishness from their Englishness in an institutional sense. And I think in that particular instance, things might kind of, and so I'm kind of cautioning people that I'm talking to, that they might experience some sort of backlash if something like this was to be attempted. But we don't know if it's going to be attempted. We don't know what's going to happen in a week, as Ellie well knows, much less what's going to happen within 2 years or so. So I'll leave it there. I mean, I'll have to think about the Brexit.
Karlo, and while others may be preparing their comments, I have a question too. I initially had the similar reaction to Ellie when she was saying, basically, I think aren't all states multinational states kind of thing, right? So I also had that reaction initially, but then I started having a different reaction. Aren't all multinational states also kind of national states, right? Which is the reverse of that logic. So meaning, you seem to be saying it's a matter of degree. Okay, I understand that. But you seem to also implying that all multinational states, what you call backlash, in a way, it's another way of saying, well, they also act like what we consider ideal, typical nation states, although we call them multinational states. And I was trying to figure out what could be the thing that puts them apart. And it seems to me that multinational states are much more likely to be able, or from the get-go, to have institutional solutions to this problem, while not multinational states, at least nominally multinational states, may not have those tools to go down the Gordon Brown road. So that was just a suggestion of how you would think about that. Yeah. we have to end the call in about 5 minutes, so we will be done by 1:10, I think, DC time. Is that fine? Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Sounds good. That's a great point, Harris. I think, I mean, I do have this when I teach my class on secession. I basically, the distinction that I make is in terms of the conditional versus unconditional legitimacy of the territorial framework. So I use the example of Colombia that experienced a 50-year-long civil war, kind of where you had different areas controlled by different factions, and it never occurred to anybody to basically say, why don't we split the country and have peace, right? Because the idea of the state in those borders is so naturalized that there is no, it's a ridiculous idea to even contemplate any sort of alternative to what it is. Whereas in multinational states, I would argue the territorial political framework is not necessarily on the menu all the time, but it is conditional. It is conditional in a way in which nation statehood isn't, I would say.
Thank you. Any last question? We have some really patient audience members here. Adam, do you want to add something on the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation case? Because it seems it fits with your work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting book. I really look forward to reading it. So I had really a question, maybe because I'm looking more at the, I guess, under centralizing states where you're seeing kind of a reverse process almost under Putin. And I wonder really, because I get the impression that there's this asymmetrical relationship between people in the minorities. They really care about these symbols, whereas sometimes they can sort of trigger majority groups because they bring to mind versions of the state that are incompatible. And I wondered, in your work, is there a situation in which, upon receiving some of this symbolic recognition, the actual meaning of these symbols themselves starts to atrophy or starts to weaken because it becomes internalized by the majority group? I mean, I'm just thinking, I don't know too much about the Quebec case, but it seems that it's become more normal for people to have these Quebec flags and autonomy, but then the actual secessionism has somewhat abated. And I just wondered how that dynamic plays into the conception of the state, and whether you see these minority symbols actually losing power once they, ironically, maybe have some achievement in politics. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. I wouldn't argue that the symbols themselves, and in this particular instance, you're talking about very, very symbolic symbols, not institutions themselves, right? But I would argue that the symbols themselves have not lost power. I would argue that the expression of that kind of political, the political thrust is different. It's kind of directed in a different direction. And I think part of the reason is because nobody in Canada has dared touch the constitutional question for a generation now. And I think that was the smartest thing that they could have done. It goes back to the answer that I gave to Liz, right? Where they kind of learned their lesson. They were like, no, don't touch this, right? And I think that's in a way why I'm cautioning the kind of the British elite. I think, and that's an interesting question. It's a question I ask my students. Well, can a multinational state become either less multinational, or can it become a nation state? And the only country that I can kind of think of where you had sort of very sharply divided claims and a secessionist war, which was then welded together to the point where now those kinds of things are not on territorial lines anymore, is the United States. In a way. Now, was it a multinational or binational state? Antebellum, I don't know, but at least there's a potential claim to be made. There's enough literature to suggest as much. But I would emphasize, sort of as a last point, is that it's not only so every single one of these institutions that I was talking about, the way in which formal institutions are organized, they're symbolic for both sides, but the valence of symbolism may be different. So let's say in Canada or in Spain, majorities emphasize symmetry, territorial symmetry of territorial units, right? And the reason they do that is because they believe that symmetry expresses the notion that for all of our diversity, we're all the same nation. But that symmetry that is kind of welcomed and greeted by, let's say, the majority population is seen by at least a chunk of the minority as basically harmful to their own vision of what the state actually is, if that makes sense, right? So it's a symbol for both sides. It just has a completely different kind of emotional charge for each of the sides. And I'm of course oversimplifying that because there's obviously a range among Catalans and the Basques, and a range among the Spanish themselves, if that makes sense.
Yes, I in a way, I wish I was in your classroom, Karlo. You managed to put a lot of things in very little time, and I'm glad we covered a lot of territory. I want to thank Ellie for serving as the discussant, and I want to advertise that we're going to do a similar event for her book soon, so stay tuned. And I want to thank our audience for staying all the way, and I've been getting messages indicating that people enjoyed this conversation, so thanks again, and I hope you have great sales, Karlo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Harris, again, and thank you, Ellie, and to everybody else and for the questions.